teacher go to school.
What do you think of what's going on right now, mate?
These evil little invisible parasites.
Satan-worshipping Freemason moron.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
We're not run by factions.
Get the fuck out of camera!
There are much more powerful international forces in play.
Is this pink eye? Is this what pink eye is? I don't fucking know what's happening.
Please go outside and look at the moon quickly.
It's been crazy, guys, but guess what? It's how it is, mate.
Mate, because I want to do you slowly.
But I ain't spending any time on it.
Welcome to the Conditional Release Program, a podcast that delves into the netherworld of cults, crims, and con artists. I'm Jack the Insider, otherwise known as Peter Hoisted for tax purposes.
And I'm Joel Hill, and today we have a very special guest who is a worker at the very pointy end of public health in Victoria. He's not an administrator, he doesn't push pencils, but he is a man who worked on the floor of a major public hospital when COVID cases spun out of control.
Yes, John, as we will call him, has many stories of the vast ordeals public health teams faced while performing major surgery as hospitals were forced to deal with life-threatening moments in the full chaos of a pandemic.
Yeah, fuck that. And John has much to say of interest to all of our listeners on how the public health system continued to make itself available to everyone, that's right, cookers, including those who refused vaccination but were cared for anyway, despite their screams otherwise. And of course, this came at a huge cost in labour and resources. That's the true part.
Afterwards, they had the fucking temerity to be rude to everyone who saved their dismal fucking lives.
I know, isn't it just fucking sickening? And despite having a health work on the podcast this week, I am still drinking craft beer at high volumes, and big thanks to our beer sponsor CB Co for throwing in a few small ales because I've had way too many last week. It was just really indulgent, and it's
we're trying to talk about health here, Joel.
I know. Look, I'm having a mid-strength today because,
oh, well, there you go.
The CB Co Small Ale it's a good bid. So, it's delicious and low calorie.
Well, when we talk about John, and one of the things he says about dealing with anti-vaxxers, cookers, etc., is he goes, "This is why I drink."
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Anyway, while Joel is now getting his beer for free, we'd just like to remind our listeners that this show is also free, but we would love you to throw a few dong our way. We accept dong, don't we, Joel? I think we do accept
It's the
dong.
funniest currency. Of course I'm going to take it.
It is hilarious.
It's almost as good as
hilarious
shilojis.
international currency, the
Yeah.
dong. So please throw a few dongs our way.
Yeah. If you put a VPN on, you can probably actually pay in dong. But if you simply just go to www.patreon.com/conditional release program. Of course, just search Patreon conditional release program. For as little as $5 a month, you have access to all manner of patent content. We just did a show then, and it includes hopefully a weekly premium episode. Sometimes we miss one. Zoom calls every month, and just chats and access, parasocial relationship. Get around it.
Yeah, and get on that, please, listeners, so we can continue to bring you excellent content like the following interview I did with John, a surgical theatre technician at one of Melbourne's biggest public hospitals, and the utter madness the pandemic wrought while cookers lost their minds outside.
So without any further ado, here it is, listeners. I'm not doing another beer plug. We're getting straight into it. This is our deeper dive interview for the week, and look, we are proud of it. I really enjoyed editing it because listening to this was a really great thing. I usually hate editing, but this was fantastic. We are proud of John for all the work he's done, and we think you should give it a bit of a nudge on social media, give it a bump, because this is a really important insider's first-hand account of a really important time in history, and it needs to be heard.
I still haven't worked it out yet. And if you haven't worked it out, keep asking the question and keep looking for the answers because it's irrelevant.
Well, g'day, listeners, and joining me today, we have the very great honour of interviewing John. It's not his real name, but that's okay. John works in Victoria's public health system, and he is a theatre technician and auto-transfusion technician. You might, firstly, thanks for joining us today, John.
No problems.
But you might just want to start off by telling us what you do.
All right. So a theatre technician helps with the setup and sort of organise and configuration of the operating theatre. So there can be a fair amount of variation depending on what you're up to. So if you're doing what we would just call a basic laparotomy, so if you're just opening someone up who's got like a bowel obstruction or something, that can be a pretty basic setup, all the way up to major brain surgery or, transplant work.
Transplants.
Yeah,
Yep.
we can particularly get into that. And so that's normally the role I do. The auto transfusion element of it is we have a machine called a cell saver, which if you're bleeding out, rather than pumping you full of units, so, units of blood, which is a finite resource, and, there's never enough to go around, and it can sort of come in peaks and troughs. Sometimes the hospital only has, a certain number of units and may need to triage them. So one of the options we can do there is essentially, if you're bleeding out, we can slurp that up, stick it in a machine. This is very much layman terms. Spin it and
slurping.
Slurping. Yeah, there we go. It's from the original root Latin. So that we can slurp that up. Put some anticoagulants in it. Spin it and refine it. Back into some of its base elements, and then give it back to you, so that it's less of a burden on the finite supply of blood that's out there.
So your job really revolves around some tried and true problem solving exercises. Regarding the deficiency. It might be a good time now to remind our listeners, if they're not blood donors, to give that very, very serious consideration. We also might urge our listeners to complete the online form in regard to organ donations
please.
As well. Yes, please. Those things are very, very important. They save lives.
So blood and organ donation really do. They make a massive difference. I've worked in both. Both fields. In Victoria, we do liver transplant is based out of the Austin, and heart transplant is based out of the Alfred. I have had the pleasure of working at both sites in my career, and being on that list and being willing to donate those organs should tragedy strike, and you're how to put this. You're in a position where you yourself are definitely going to pass, but you may be able to give the gift of life to others.
Absolutely.
That's ultimately, it's probably one of the most generous things people can do. So if they've ever been considering that, it's on the website. It's very, very simple to do.
Easy
I've
to
done
do.
it. I have the card in my wallet, and yes, please give it some serious consideration.
If you're in New South Wales, and I'm not sure about the rest of Australia, but if you're in New South Wales and you just simply tick the box on your driver's licence, that's really not enough. You need to go a little bit further and get on the website and make that donation. Your gift could save lives. Very, very briefly, I just want to tell a story, a wonderful story really, that extended the life of Mark Colvin, one of the great journalists in Australia, and a friend of mine who was covering the genocide in Rwanda and picked up a very, very nasty disease there that was not diagnosed for many, many months. He was very, very, very ill in England and lost, among other things, a great deal of his kidney function. It was only when a donor came forward, a woman that he actually interviewed on when he was host of PM at the ABC, and a woman that he interviewed, they struck up a bit of a conversation afterwards, and she went away and quietly did the test to determine if her kidney would work with Mark's, and it did. Mark had the operation. He was spared the 3 or 4 days of dialysis every week, where he used to famously tweet from, with a great many followers on Twitter. And then, of course, we saw him afterwards, and his life had changed so dramatically. It was just a wonderful thing to see. In the end, cancer got him, and he died some years ago, and it was a cataclysmic event for the media. I think generally it was the death of one of our greats. But he did have his life extended by this extraordinary gift of an organ donation. John, just tell me, what was it like? I mean, look, let's start off by saying thank you for everything that you do.
Oh, thanks.
But what was it like at the very pointy end of surgery in a major hospital during the period, the first year of COVID? The pandemic had struck, and there was a number of fatalities very early on. There were no vaccines. What was it like to be working in the public health system at that time?
It was pretty tense. So I won't name the specific hospital, but I was in a big inner city hospital with a very, very large operating theatre suite. So we had 12 theatres. So initially what we were doing was obviously anything that could get postponed got postponed. So I think we dropped down to 6 theatres, which so obviously half our workload then, so we're now down to half our workload to a little extent. Initially, we were sitting around, for the first couple of weeks. It wasn't so much twiddling thumbs, but it was, we were finding sort of, tasks to do. And like everyone else, we were looking at the media and wondering, shit, where's this going to go? And we were seeing things that were coming out of New York and coming out of some of the other larger population centres. And we were just wondering, okay, is this going to get this bad? And then sort of the call came out to the people who could. So in my role doesn't so much translate out of theatre too much, but whereas a bunch of our nurses, so anyone who was ICU trained, they were sort of initially they were given the option to volunteer to go.
Work in emergency medicine, and dealing with COVID cases.
To be reallocated to either work the COVID ICU, which was rapidly getting procedures and things written for it almost on the fly in those initial months, or go down and work in ED or on this newly established COVID ward. We saw a fair amount of attrition, as in at that point some of the younger nurses who were just kind of, I suppose, in their initial training and trying it on, a bunch of those went, maybe this isn't for me. And we also saw a bunch of, the older nurses, the older people who were working with us, they either were experiencing a lot of anxiety about that. And in some cases, it kind of shook some people out of the tree who were like, I was waiting for a moment to retire, and now's probably a good one. So we saw a little bit of that. Now, what specifically happened in our situation was initially, beyond the vax, it was more about the test. And so what we then had happen was, because initially I think the turnaround time for a PCR was, I think, something like 6 hours. It's now, gotten down to, I think, 45 minutes. And obviously the RAT test, while not being as accurate, that now takes minutes. So that's fine. But initially it was the whole thing of, if we have someone who, say, had a heart attack or had a brain bleed, we need to get them on the table and we don't have time to wait. So we are going to operate as if they've got COVID. And so for us as theatre staff, it was this whole process of what we call donning and doffing, where, you would put on, everyone would gown up, you would put on the full N95, or if we had them, what were they called? The PAPA masks, which are sort of the more enclosed breathing sense. They are almost literally what you've seen.
Almost like a dual carriage respirator.
Oh, no. I'm not even. I'm more thinking the whole thing with the face shield. Have you ever seen a film where people are going into the hot zone? Almost literally, if you remember the old film Outbreak, it was, literally one of those full drop down with its own ventilator that's strapped to the back to your back, and someone could come up and replace the power pack for you. You would kind of back your way out to the back of a door. You would poke someone would come up, unclick, grab a new power pack, slot that on, slot a new one in, and then you just kind of walk back forward. So we were doing
right.
I'm sorry.
So the presumption was, in the absence of a CPR test, the presumption was that a patient who was being operated on may have COVID.
We would presume they have it until we have confirmation that they don't. But even then, there was a couple of incidences, didn't happen at the hospital I worked at, where halfway through they got told, PCR test has come back and it's negative, and everyone went, oh, good, and took their masks off.
Whew.
And then it turned out to be a false negative, and half the staff got it. So
how long are your shifts? I mean, this is something that presumably hasn't changed, but how long were those shifts? Are those shifts?
What I know for a fact was, so we had a lot of disaster planning for if it goes bad, right? And at that stage, we were talking about putting us on 14-hour shifts, and 14-hour shifts, and then essentially doing all of your work, over a 3-day period, and then not coming back for 3 days, because it would mean if a whole block catches COVID or needs to isolate, we could slot new people in. So it wouldn't mean that you had all the staff there all the time. Yes. So it would mean that if we had an outbreak at work, which did happen, if we had an outbreak, it would take out, a third of us, not 80% of us, and then we'd be unable to operate. Because one of the big concerns that we have, look, a lot of the big specialities, like let's say, for example, brain, in Victoria, at any one point, in terms of people who have worked up, who are consultant brain surgeons, there's maybe 30 of these guys.
Yeah.
So if all of them catch COVID at the same time,
wow.
Yeah.
You
if
got
all
a
of them catch
calamity
COVID,
on your hands.
Yeah. If all of them catch COVID at the same time, or a good chunk of them catch COVID, we have lost the ability to do major brain surgery in Victoria.
Mm.
People are going to die of stuff which they normally wouldn't have, and that's ditto. And that duly applies for major heart surgeons. I think the numbers are higher. I think the numbers are. Do not quote me. I think the numbers. I think there's something like maybe 80. And this is statewide. So obviously, I think there's maybe 60 to 80. Qualified. Heart specialists.
Yes.
And if they had a convention or something, or if they're all just hanging out in the tea room, and then it turns out one of them's caught COVID, again, it's the whole sort of thing of a lot of these guys are older, they've got, other health factors, and if they catch COVID unvaxxed, they could well be on the ventilator, they could well be dying, and then, we've lost a chunk of our very vital, experienced workforce. So, we were all deathly afraid of, catching it and spreading it. So during that initial 2020 period, it was, doing even very, very simple basic surgery still took like 6 hours. So doing something very simple, like let's say an emergency appendectomy, a case which you can normally bang out in say 45 minutes via laparoscope, that then ballooned out to being the theatre was shut down for 6 hours because you would then have to, not only would you would need to recover the patient in the room, kind of get them
That's
completely masked up, then take them to the COVID ward. Then you would need to decontaminate the whole room either by traditional methods or by this UV cleaning robot that they went out and bought us, the magic COVID killing light bulb.
Robots. Okay.
It's a robot in the most...
The traditional methods were...
bleach.
Glen 20 spray.
Bleach and elbow grease. It was wheeling that in there and just, cleaning the ever-living shit out of everything. There's still a bunch of operating theatre equipment that we've got now, which is weirdly discoloured. And we're like, why is that a fun shade of orange? And you're like, oh, COVID, man, that's because it got the ever-loving shit blasted out of it with really high-end chemicals that we normally don't use. And it's one of those things where there's nothing actually wrong with it, so there's no point, replacing it.
So these were extraordinary times. There's an immense amount of planning going on.
Yeah.
Driven by caution and driven by an understanding that there could be a significant collapse in various sectors of surgery at any given time.
But also, Jack, one of the things which we were told and which I learned, we had a situation where we were told where if you have COVID and you need a particular variety of heart surgery that needs a bypass, at the time we had no way of ensuring that bypass machine could be 100% sterilized in a way that it wouldn't have, COVID in it. And so we were told that, no, if you need a particular surgery, they're actually, because then, of course, because you also had the global slowdown and the global disruption, we were told that, no, that bypass machine would need to be junked and a replacement was 9 months to a year away. So was there rolling of the dice there, or were there absolute rules that were followed? Again, to the best of my knowledge, it's a situation that never came up.
Right.
But it would have been, almost like a triage moment where, people higher above than us on the ground would have come together and said, all right, this guy's potentially got COVID. He needs, his LAD has split all the way up to the breastbone. So we're going to have to put him on bypass. What do we do here? It's like, well, do we sacrifice essentially one of these machines which cannot be replaced?
I see, yeah.
Which means then that we can only run, rather than running 2 to 3 cardiac theatres, we can now only run 2 because the machine's out and we can't do it anymore. What do we do in that situation? Now, luckily at the site where I was working at the time, that was a question that never needed to get answered.
You didn't have to make that decision because that's a huge decision to make, isn't it?
But it was hovering around. And so a lot of this stuff, a lot of these bombs never dropped, but, they could well have. And it's one of the things which I look, I've got, it's outside my scope of practice a little bit. I have a brother who works in. I'll come say. I have a brother who works at ESTA. So that's the Emergency Services Telecommunications Authority.
Right.
And so he was keeping me informed of some of the disaster planning that was coming, down the line. And, there's the whole sort of thing of if it got as bad as New York. And, mate, there were plans in spot to essentially roll out the army. There was plans in spot for, if you thought the cookers lost it at the ideas of not being able to go out, only 5 kilometres, it was literally going to be papers, please. It was, if it gets as bad as New York. I mean, another fun fact, which a lot of people don't actually realise, in Victoria, most of the large hospitals, so Alfred, Austin, I think Dandenong, certainly Frankston, they're all 100 years old. They are specifically built next to very large parklands because they were all built around the time of the Spanish flu. And so those parklands are there for, specifically for if we need to build tent wards.
Roll out the tents, yeah.
And if things go really, really bad, dig mass graves, mate.
Very nasty. But all these things were on the table.
They were all on the table. And I said we were all seeing all of this happen in places like New York. We all saw the footage of them taking the wooden caskets out, digging a trench and all of these refrigerated trucks backed up outside major New York hospitals.
It's indeed what we saw in New York. It's indeed what we saw in Italy. It's indeed but much of southern Italy in particular, and Turkey again, in and around Ankara. This is where basically the shit did hit the fan.
Yeah, and I feel like that could have been us, So
I've just been having long and involved arguments about lockdowns and the necessity of them, and certainly in that first period, I've come to the view that I'm perfectly comfortable supporting lockdowns in some ways. There are other things that perhaps, other things attached to them that I just dispute. Yeah, we can talk about why curfews were introduced and stuff. It all seems a bit nonsensical.
We can armchair all of that shit. We can do all. I said I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't pretend to be one on the internet. But all I know is that
it's a great place to pretend.
Absolutely, yeah. All I know is that the numbers went up, and me as a frontline healthcare worker was feeling the pressure. And then the lockdowns came in, numbers went back down again, and we had those 0 days. Look, you can say whatever you like, in regards to lockdowns or about some of the specifics of it. At no point did anyone hand me a shovel and say, John, today your job is to walk across to the park and help dig a very big pit. And I genuinely feel like, lockdown, the procedures that the government took are a large reason as to why.
Absolutely. And I think we were well served by geography, which is really just a bit of luck.
Oh, yeah.
Rather than anything else, because you're a whopping great island kind of in the middle of nowhere. Whereas these cases were raging in North America and Europe and later Asia. Yeah. And then we move forward to the vaccine period, and our vaccine rollout started quite slowly, of course. First sleeve to be rolled up might have been Scott Morrison's, and I think that was very early January in 2021. And then the vaccine rolled out to sort of spluttering along the way along issues around AstraZeneca, particularly for younger recipients of that particular vaccine being identified and dealt with. There were some deaths, but cardiologists and emergency medical specialists determined how to get around it. I mean, again, we get into that problem-solving area and how you beat that. But by September, depending on which state you're in, we started hitting these high points, these high 70s, and then moved on 80s and 90s in terms of vaccination rate. Firstly, tell me how that affected, how that impacted on surgery in that, sort of that immediate point of not so much lockdowns being lifted, but having those really high vaccine rates coming into the community. Did it slow down? Was there a release of pressure, a release of anxiety?
To an extent, not really. Like, I mean, look. Initially, it was great to see the roll. It was great to see the vaccine rolling out, and it certainly helped. But what I know initially was, and to the best of my knowledge, I know that I believe the hospital higher ups, particularly the legal people, were incredibly gun shy about the idea of cross contamination, about the idea of someone coming in for surgery that was unrelated, someone who's been vaxxed or someone who's been vaxxed or was in the process of getting vaxxed, coming in for surgery, catching COVID off someone who was within the hospital.
Yes.
And then, having some, then having, either, complications, leading up to, their own death. I know that, from a medical legal standpoint, they were incredibly gun shy about that because I think you still can. I think you can still, because I know at the time, you can still kind of trace it back and go, okay, I got it off this person and this person. And if that was in any way provable, yeah, the payout then would have been just astronomical. So I know that for us, they were definitely afraid of that. Yes. Turnaround time on testing, it was more the big thing that helped us out. But again, we just sort of, and they started, opening things up again. You started being able to get, sort of hip replacements and whatnot. And so we just sort of had this incredible backlog. So then it was, okay, we've had our little period of lull. Now it's time to get back in there, guys. And we're like, thank you, higher ups who are zooming in from home. That was a wonderful moment where we all got told to knuckle down and get back to work.
While I'm patting my dog.
Yeah, on a Zoom call from a healthcare executive who's clearly at home in a hoodie.
All right. So
yeah, that was a wonderful moment. We loved him.
So we're getting to the point, rather obviously, as how you would have to deal with people who refuse to vaccinate.
Oh boy. So this did not happen that often. There wasn't millions of people outside refusing the vax. There was a couple. Now, and there was one in particular. They are not going to be named. They are a prominent. I had the pleasure of encountering a prominent social media cooker. And this individual needed
full-on anti-vaxxer,
and like a noted figure within sort of the freedom movement.
All right, given to bizarre statements about the vaccine and
the shape of the earth. Yeah, one of those.
Right.
And this individual needed surgery, and so because I've been quote unquote cooker watching sort of about midway through. That's where I just sort of discovered that there was this whole subset of people on Twitch who were watching, and so I knew who a bunch of the prominent figures were. In actual fact, one time I actually did put. Because of the joys of Chromecast, I was able to put their stream up in a tea room television. And so we were all sitting there laughing along. There's a clip in particular that I've got. It's just me filming of it where this one, I don't know if she's this one deregistered nurse, this lunatic, stood up at one of the big Melbourne rallies and was like, she's saying, and now because of COVID, operating theatre staff are having to work 7 days a week and sometimes till 3 a.m. And you're like, that was happening anyway. That was happening pre-COVID. That happens. We work all night if that's what needs to happen. We don't.
That's right.
We don't say to people, "Oh, you've had a major heart attack."
I'm sorry. We have to leave you outside to bleed out because we're going home.
And they were sitting there saying, doctors are deciding, whose surgery goes ahead and who doesn't. And I'm like, we've had a category system forever. That's just how that works.
It's really important to get that across to our audience. Perhaps understand these processes. But if someone presents to hospital either unvaccinated or refusing to vaccinate, based on some bizarre principle or theory that they hold, you're going to have to operate on them anyway.
We have a universal healthcare system, mate. If you're bleeding the fuck out, we are going to step in and help you. It doesn't matter who you are.
Okay, we're not going to disagree about having a universal healthcare system, but it does lead to this bizarre situation where someone who's refused to vaccinate, hanging around with other people who refuse to vaccinate, by the way, in public protests and so forth, where they are likely to have COVID or to have had or be transmissible with COVID, and what procedures were followed when you had to operate on some of these people, and you're talking about one in particular?
Well, on my pointy end of it, so what we had to do was, so I was actually on night shift, so on the night shift before this individual was coming in. So what I had to do was, we were told, we were going to make an airlock up the fire escape, which we did. So we got out, meters and meters of plastic tarp, and we locked off all that area. It just so happened to be going past an equipment storage room. So at 3:00 in the morning, I had to drag what I think is literally 7 tons. Now it's on wheels. I can move it around.
Right.
But at 3:00 in the morning, I had to move literally 7 tons of equipment. So I think at that point that was a specialized traction table designed for hips. I had to move that all by myself, plus a bunch of other, in sundries out of that room, so we could line that with plastic. So this one individual could walk up, so we could bring them into the hospital via the back stairs, into the operating suite, then into their specialized room, which again is already covered in plastic, so that we could get this relatively straightforward procedure done. Now, what I've then been able to work out from talking to my colleagues, because this individual was so ill, they had to, because they were looking to do a couple of things. I'm not going to know specific details.
No.
They had to abandon because this person's health was, well, not so much abandoned. They did half the operation. They were going to do it. It was going to be more of an extensive operation. But then the anaesthetist sat there and said, "This person is so ill, I don't think we're going to be able to continue on to do the other part." Because there's a very real possibility, they make quite a
risk assessed. Yes.
Yeah. The shorthand we use is drop the bundle, but it's, crash and potentially have a heart attack or something halfway through the operation. So they abandoned halfway through. I know this individual, so was then we got them. We recovered them in the room. We then got them up to the ward, where they then proceeded to start live streaming the whole event, claimed that we were all,
Oh, my Lord.
I will send you the link if you really want, because it's still there. I will, then proceeded to trash talk all of us, tell us how we gave them the jab while they were under. We didn't. And as far as I know, through things at the nursing staff, the particular hospital that I worked at actually doesn't have a do not admit policy. There's a couple of the other larger ones. If you are a particularly trash human, they will give you a do not attend policy where, obviously if you're bleeding out, they'll operate on you or they'll provide care. But if you just kind of front up, it's like, no, you're on a list, you punched a nurse, out, right? Yeah. The particular institution that I was in doesn't have that list because they're nominally a religious organization. So, it's one of those things where it's a public health thing, but it's backed by a church.
Anyone is welcome. Yeah.
Anyone is
regardless of how bad your behaviour has been.
So there's certain things which I don't do, but so this individual will still be treated there, and I believe it's probably the only one they can be treated at.
So after live feeding, his partial recovery, he was returned to surgery, and his procedure was conducted positively, one presumes, because without getting into the name of the character, we know he's still around.
Yeah, still walking the streets, still attending major freedom rallies. So we're like, "You're welcome, mate." And again, this then becomes that whole
welcome.
Thing.
Yeah.
Well, this then becomes that whole thing that a lot of us rage against ever so slightly.
7 tons of gear being shifted around.
I had to move 7 tons of gear.
Being created
a full airlock. And also we can then start talking about, look, in terms of the general cost, not so much in money, but in terms of the waste that we then produced. Because,
that's what I'm getting
very,
at
very
too.
thick airlock quality tarp, or, that sort of, that stuff's not necessarily cheap. So we just produced probably, if you can imagine those very large those very large black. Oh, in this case they were yellow bags. So it's all surgical stuff. So the yellow bags don't go to landfill; they get incinerated, and the cost of that is in weight. So we probably generated maybe 2 tons of waste, which then had to be incinerated. So it's in the atmosphere. You're breathing that in. So Mother Nature takes one for the team. Yet again, thank you, cookers.
The circle of life.
The circle of life goes on.
Look, it's not your job to know this, and I don't know this, but we could just quietly muse on the dollar figure involved in giving this guy life-changing surgery, life-saving surgery, in fact, and it would rack up literally into the thousands, and we could go a bit beyond that probably.
Well, we know for a fact that keeping an operating theatre working with nobody in it is $10,000 an hour. Right. So if you go with the idea of this individual had the goddamn jab, the surgery that they would have had, the surgery that they would have had probably would have been maybe an hour and a half.
So baseline 20,000.
Baseline 20,000,
and then
baseline
the rest.
20,000, and then the rest depending on what we were doing and what consumables we were using. Ultimately, shutting that down and putting all these things down, rack that up to another 6, recovering him in the room, rack that up to another 6 or 7. Yeah, yep. Actually, going off the top of my head from what I recall, the entire theatre was booked out for the entire morning, so they didn't get that back up and running until 1:30 in the afternoon. So that's a whole other that's 6 hours. On what would have been maybe 2, and then you could perform other surgeries after.
We're getting into some big numbers.
We're getting into some very big numbers there, and that's sort of what just happens. And then, then you can ultimately, and if you want to go down that road, beyond just the general human cost, keeping a human being in ICU just isn't that. And this was something which I do kind of want to touch on, because for a while there, a good chunk of the population was jabbed, and to the vast majority of the population, things were back to normal, but we were in the middle of a COVID spike. This was around the time of, we can put a time on it, because this was something that really did affect me. I may get a little emotional here, where this was around the time of the Kill the Bill vigil that was happening on the steps of Parliament.
So November 2021.
Thank you very much. I would need to have looked that up, And at the time, I was reallocated to COVID ICU. The call had gone out. They said, look, we need runners. We need people who are who are going to be, fully donned in COVID ICU, because we need help, essentially moving things around, non-nursing support role, what would normally be called a patient services assistant role. And I put my hand up, volunteered to do that, because at the time I was single and I was living alone. So if I'd caught it, at that point I was I think double vaxxed. And if I'd caught it, it'd be like, I'm going to have a rough week. But I wasn't living with, say, a newborn baby. Yes. Or in my case, or an elderly mother who's got other complications. So I went, no, I'll be first in the door on that. And this thing was, everyone was like, yeah, it's all over now, or we can go back to our lives. But we were in the middle of a COVID spike, and people were still intubated and people were still dying. And there was one incident which I feel like I was privileged to have seen, or privileged to have been there for. Excuse me. But I did see a woman when we helped her don and doff. She came in and she was there to say goodbye to her husband as he passed. And so that was still going on. And then I got the joy of having to see that, having to, usher her out the door. And he expired, I think, probably about 45 minutes later. Mm-hmm. And I helped load him into the transport trolley and took him downstairs, took him down to the morgue. And then, my shift was over. I decontaminated, and I got to walk past the party that they were having outside.
Outside the Parliament there.
Yeah, and I didn't engage. I really wanted to scream at them.
Yeah.
I kept on walking. I ended up getting halfway down Burke Street, and I started crying, man, because again, you've got people out there who are arguing that, it's the analogy is they say tigers not real, and if they were real, they're just big cats. And here I am working the tiger injury ward, and a guy who's just been eaten by a tiger. And I don't have enough middle fingers for a lot of these people. There's a lot of these protests. It happened once, actually. I live very close to the centre of Melbourne. At the time, COVID rents in the middle of the city were amazing. They're rapidly disappearing, so I'm probably going to have to move out at some juncture. But so a lot of the big, and they're still walking. They're still running around in circles doing it.
Still doing it.
I need to make sure I'm not on the street when that happens, because it only ever happened the once. I was out with my family.
You might be obliged to engage.
Oh, I don't have enough middle fingers, but we had this incident where I was out with my family. We had masks on, And somebody just sitting there went, mate, COVID's not real. And in all honesty, the next thing I remember is my brother pulling me off him. So I say pulling me away from him. I didn't throw a punch at him.
Yeah.
But I'm sitting there yelling at him with tears in my eyes. And I think the big one was, he said, I said, you don't understand what the fuck you're doing. I fucking work healthcare. I know what it sounds like when someone dies of COVID. And as I'm walking away, this guy said to me, I'm sorry for your loss, brother. And I just had this incredible moment where I've just turned and screamed at him, you are not my fucking brother. And then the rest of the family were like, are you all right, mate? And I'm like, yeah, I guess. But
the fact of the matter is, a lot of these people, due to their behaviour, had experience of COVID that perhaps the rest of the population didn't have. I mean, and a lot of them were dealing with an ignorance and denial and so forth. But I do recall around those protest periods, virtually every one of these live streams had what Joel calls a spicy cough. And these sort of hacking groups of people.
And also, mate, I sort of know where you're going on that one. And it was just like, these people have blood on their hands, mate. I have spoken to
the influencers, most certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I have spoken to ICU nurses who know people who ended up in the ICU, ended up intubated and died, who attended the rallies. You see there people sitting there having spicy coughs, and they've been able to say, yeah, I went to the rally, particularly the one that ended up at the War Memorial where people were urinating on it and then the police broke that up. That one in particular, they attended, they recalled not feeling great 2 days later and then needing to go to, and then, ended up getting an ambulance called for them, being taken, to hospital and then being told you have COVID. It's like, I can't have COVID. COVID's not real. And, it's like, well, okay, this non-existent virus has shut down your... This non-existent virus has shut down your lungs, so we're going to have to intubate you. I hope you survive. And then they didn't.
At least it shuts them up. Intubation is going to shut them up.
It will, but, oh, mate.
Look, just quickly, what is it like to work in a protest area? Because you will have worked in a place, walking past with your uniform on, with your ID tag on, and walking past a group of protesters who are claiming COVID doesn't exist, etc.
Well, that's without naming sites. That's now happened to me twice.
Right.
Look, initially we were told for that initial bat, we were told uniform policy is now not. So we could show up to work, depending on what zone we were working in. We were either told we could either show up, we could de-uniform a little bit, which meant you had nurses running around in not so much hospital-branded scrubs, but they could show up in non-branded scrubs. And, because if you kind of put a hoodie or a jacket over it, you just kind of look like, you could just be someone who's out and about. You know what I mean?
It must contribute to anxiety, not perhaps
absolutely. Absolutely.
But the workforce generally, nurses and so forth. When we've moved into a fairly strange time when nurses are being abused. Entering and starting their shifts.
That was definitely going on. The belief from a certain someone that they were nowhere near the front entrance. You were near the front entrance, observe the photo, particularly during a particular recent protest. And that certainly had its anxieties on it. I know for a fact, the security on those particular days, I know for a fact security was beefed up. And I know that there was instructions put out. I believe that there was helpers put out to direct people into the hospital in such a way that they wouldn't walk past, the protest that was happening on those particular days. So it was, their influence was minimised, or we harm minimised as much as we could, and we just kind of hoped that it wouldn't continue. And gladly it didn't. It wasn't sort of this regular grind that we had to put up with because, they're butterflies and they don't focus on one issue. They've moved on to other things. And now as I said,
there's been a fair amount of moving on.
I'm sure you and Joel are going to comment on that because now it does seem like a bunch of the big ones have now pivoted to the great societal problem that is trans people existing.
and general amidst general homophobia. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
There is one case, and look, it's pending assessment or pending determination by VCAT at the moment, and that is a heart lung or heart transplant. A person who needs one at least, but has been excluded from the list. Now, my understanding is that and I've written about this, so I know a fair bit about it. It's not the Alfred's call. It is a call essentially of a committee of cardiothoracic surgeons and cardiologists who have determined that she doesn't meet the requirements, in particular that she is not vaccinated for COVID. As the VCAT hearing rolled out, it transpired that she has also not been vaccinated for influenza. Which is another one of those things. And we might briefly go through the list of things. I mean, you couldn't, be a smoker, for example. You couldn't be a heavy user of alcohol. I'm sure you're not told to be a teetotaler, but it would probably be advisable. But you're certainly not going to be on that heart transplant list if you're a heavy drinker. And there are a range of vaccines that you must have. I think influenza is one, and there are others as well, including COVID. And this was, as you know, this was greeted with some really appalling reporting initially on one of the breakfast television programs, saying that this woman had essentially been dudded because she'd refused to vaccinate. It turns out she's not applicable, at least on other vaccine requirements. But that caused a mess outside one particular hospital. What are your views on this? I mean, you've been involved, you've been present on the ground when transplants have occurred. Firstly, tell us what procedures. I mean, my understanding is that pharmacologically, people's recipients, their immune systems are basically shut down.
Yeah. Look, again, it's this. Look, the short answer is it's a reason why I drink. Like, it's just this whole, you know what I mean? We've all got to have a reason. Well, no, but it's one of many. But it's one of these things where, like, if people put, the smallest amount of thought into this, people like to think that it's the goddamn Operation board game where we literally just, drop you in, plug this in, stitch him up, he's good. Out he goes, and that we have these things lying around,
endless resources.
We have endless resources. These things are just lying, these things are just lying around on shelves.
You've got them in eskies. You've got half a dozen hearts in an esky just waiting to go.
Exactly. So look, fundamentally, it's the whole thing of, look, even if this individual did qualify, they are not necessarily going to get one, because hearts come in different shapes and sizes, and you need a very specific person to pass away in a very specific manner, because ultimately, so once you are brain dead, your heart then, your body then starts shutting down in a specific way that puts pressure on multiple organs. So once you get brain dead, your body starts passing away in a specific way that puts pressure on specific organs. And we essentially have a team waiting there for you to make a particular threshold in a certain time frame. And if you don't, that organ becomes non-viable. So you need a bunch of things to happen in a very particular way for you to be, for you to then get the phone call of, get your ass down to the hospital. We may have a potential donor waiting for you.
Yes.
And even then, even if the surgery is successful, then it's this whole other process of once the organ is inside you and hooked up, it's then this kind of process of dialing your immune system down to the point where it doesn't immediately attack the organ.
Yes.
And that in itself can be incredibly dicey. We've had incidences where surgery went fine, but in the post-operative space of a couple of weeks, the body attacked the organ, we lost the organ, and thus the person ended up ultimately dying. So there is just this massive, massive process that has to happen for that. And so for the media to just kind of come at Alfred Health and just go, no, we're just being bastards. We're just going, no, we're just
ideologically driven.
We're ideologically driven. We want to do this.
We've got all those arts and eskies out the back.
Even then, I saw this argument, being made, and obviously, stupid people are going to stupid.
Yeah.
But this person say, well, just give her an unjabbed one. This idea that you could have a choice of, you could say, I need a heart and it needs to come from someone who hasn't had the jab, and you're like, okay, that's just not going to happen. It just doesn't.
Statistically, almost impossible.
Statistically, it just doesn't happen. It's almost like this idea of, okay, this might be a slight jump down the rabbit hole. It's this idea of that organs, you can literally rip them out of anyone and stick them in anyone else, and they'll last in an esky. Yeah. Once you get an organ out of a human being, it's viable for 4 to 6 hours. Yeah. So you need to be in a general vicinity. A point that I like to raise with a lot of people, and again, it's this that harkens back to crazy conspiracy stuff. They like to believe that there is an international black market for organs.
Oh, that's right.
And it operates across the world.
That's where all that child trafficking goes on.
Yeah. This is where all this child trafficking is happening. And the point that I like to raise to people is Steve Jobs died of liver failure. Brought on by his pancreatic cancer.
One of the richest men in the world.
One of the richest men in the world. Now he was able to use his vast fortune to juke the system as much as he could. So he was on the donor list in both California and Nevada. In order to be able to do that, he had a medical transport. So a fully crewed up, modified Learjet, with medical staff on standby at a cost to him of something like $60,000 a day, ready to go for 3 years. All right. So overall cost to him, someone else can do the math. I'm terrible at it.
Yeah.
But overall cost to him, beyond $20 million, right? Well, 30, 50, whatever, he still died of liver failure because he died waiting. There was not one for him because the criteria just did not happen. If, think about it. If there was a shady, insert racial minority, if there was a shady Russian man or a shady Chinese man who could make himself available and said, Steve, for $1 billion, we can get you a liver. You just need to disappear. We can get you a liver. It can be done. Steve Jobs would still be alive today. He had the resources to do that.
Does not happen.
It does not happen. It does not exist. I'm not saying there isn't some interesting, dodgy shit that hasn't happened in the past.
Well, there clearly was in Jobs' case because he was able to, unlike most people, apply and be on a donors list in 2 states besides being a resident.
Yeah, he was. And also, it's a beautiful question as why the fuck does Dick Cheney have a full heart and lung transplant? At the age that he was, at the level of drinking that he was up to. That's a very good point.
It is a very good question, but don't get me started on Darren Hinch's liver, by the way. But,
we can talk about Darren Hinch's liver.
No, we won't. We'll be because we are running out of time.
We are running out of time, but yeah, you know what I mean. It's just people don't understand how it works. A simple Google search would reveal. That it's not that bloody simple.
It's not that simple.
It's just
and the list, as I understand it, it runs to the thousands. And I'm talking specifically about heart transplants.
Yes.
And on the very base Google search base foundation, which I looked at, you're averaging in Victoria around 110 to 130 heart transplants a year.
Yes. So that's a number that we have.
That's a long time to wait and a long time to obviously fail. And there are a number of we would understand. It seems perfectly reasonable in a post-pandemic or a non-pandemic atmosphere that we would understand that there are certain medical or social measures that a patient would need to undertake in order to qualify for them, including not smoking, including being vaccinated. I fail to understand what the problem is there. VCAT will make a determination about all of that. You may have watched some of the proceedings. They were quite amusing, but I won't go into that other than to say that the person representing the transplant hopeful was a person who had been refused to represent clients in NCAT and New South Wales.
If once
parallel administrative affairs appeal area, but she was allowed to represent this particular person in Victoria.
It's been good comedy. Once because it is adjourned, but once the VCAT proceedings pop up, I know that they're being broadcast live. I don't think they're allowed to be saved. But if you find yourself, during the day able to watch one, if you ever get the chance to watch them, I'd suggest doing so, because when you get to see, an actual expert versus a quack in a properly moderated, legal proceeding, it's always and they're not able to do what they normally do in the ridiculous internet spaces where they gish gallop or where they just kind of run over things and and use the other various different tactics. So if you're able to watch those, do so, because there's been some amazing moments of, well, you're not an expert and I am. That's inaccurate because and then
yeah.
I didn't know that.
It is one of those areas we must, of course, wait for VCAT to hand down their findings, but it was, frankly, a little bit concerning. I just want to say, John, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, no problems.
It's really been an eye-opener, and I know it will be for our listeners, just how hard you guys worked. The sense of doom and anxiety around you at times must have been overwhelming.
Oh, yeah.
And then you had to deal with idiots and driven idiots. This show takes a view that we understand that some people might be anti-vaccine, but it's the influences we really despise, and we'd like to keep a very close eye on them. You actually had contact with one of them who presented to the hospital for surgery, cost the taxpayer. Well, we got up to a very high figure, just in an estimate, and then had the fucking temerity to abuse you for it as well.
Well, there was one particular moment that I just want to raise, and we might leave listeners on this one. So I was watching a cooker stream, and it was your friend of mine, Darren Bergwerg, where someone, one of his dupes, one of his followers said, has my place got the resources in place for emergency medicine? and then Bergwerg was like, no, not yet, but we will.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not quite yet.
But we will. So if you need emergency surgery or, you need anything, I would still suggest going to a hospital, but don't go unless your leg's falling off or something. So I'm of course just beside myself at this, because this little old woman who looks like, if I've got a funny tickle in my chest.
Yeah.
But Darren said I shouldn't go unless it's bad. And it's like, yeah, that's
the cost of it.
That's the cost of it. She may well end up, just dead on the floor because that funny tickle may have been the beginnings of a heart attack. And, but oh no, Darren said that, we're all Freemasons and global elitists down here at the ER. Yeah. And that's it. Look, there's blood on these people's hands, and I just don't have enough. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I do not have enough middle fingers for these people.
As I've always said, sooner or later, every cult becomes a death cult.
Yeah,
and
good point.
And there we are. John, thank you so much for your time today. It's been great having you, and thank you for making yourself available.
Thanks a lot, Jack.
Thanks for what you do too. Cheers.
Yeah, it's my job. Thanks, mate.
And you have been listening to the Conditional Release Program with your hosts, Jack the Insider and Joel Hill.
Jack can be found on Twitter on @JackTheInsider and Joel on @CrunchyMoses with a K. Set up a Facebook page. You can find it fairly easily. Just search for Conditional Release Program shitposting. It's there. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it on social media. Find a way. Even though Facebook sucks now, just put it on there. Your uncle might listen. We do have a Patreon. We've mentioned it a million times, but we just keep on doing it because we hope that you'll help us keep this thing sustainable, because it is bloody time-consuming. We've still got to pay the rent. It's very sad. So just, if you can help keep the lights on, that'd be great, because it is a lot of work. For as little as $5 a month, you have access to all sorts of bonus content, including a weekly premium episode, which we try and make worth your while. We put a bit of effort into it,
Yes, we do. We look after our patrons. Finally, all feedback, tips, and death threats should be sent to the Conditional Release Program podcast@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you, even to tell us that our program saved your lives. But we can go and get fucked anyway.
Oh, for fuck's sake. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, listeners. See you next time.
See ya. Bye.
I don't think I ever want to talk to any of those people.
Fuck me, you guys are bastards.